Hello and welcome back to Anna Rose Reads the podcast. I am your host Anna, and we are back in full swing officially as of right now. Today's episode marks the beginning of the podcast for 2026 after taking a solid break between Christmas and now. It's always good to rest, recover, and gear up for the new year. I have a very full schedule planned for, I'd say, the first quarter to the first half of this year that I am super thrilled about. I've recorded some incredible conversations already that I am really, really excited to share with all of you. And today's conversation is no exception. John Fram joins me today to talk about his books, namely The Bright Lands, which was his debut novel that came out, I believe, in 2019. If you like sports-related horror, if you like Southern horror, if you like Texas horror, if you like small-town horror, that book is definitely for you. And we also chat about his most recent release, The Midnight Knock, which is very much a locked room mystery that takes a hard right turn into some really interesting territory. So we will be discussing both of these books at length. We avoid spoilers as best as we can. But yeah, it's good to be back. I will catch up with you guys after. Hello, John. Welcome to Anna Rose Reads. You are my first guest of 2026 officially. I'm thrilled to have you here. How are you?
I'm fantastic. This is such a pleasure.
Thank you so much for coming on. Over the winter break, I kind of had the pleasure of reading two of your books, Midnight Knock and The Bright Lands, and I really, really enjoyed both of them. Just a little free marketing there, holding up those covers. I wanted to reach out to you to get you on to talk about these, but in big terms, I just really wanted to talk to you about how you approach your craft because you're writing about small town horror in like Texas. I'm from Louisiana, so I feel like we have a lot in common as far as interests go there. But for people who are not as familiar with you as I am, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. My name's John. I'm from Texas. I grew up here and then lived in New York for a few years, moved back to Texas during COVID. So most of my life been in Texas, for better and for worse. And I felt, I've been writing since I was a kid and never really could pin down. It was hard. I think what's interesting when you're young and like you really want to be a writer, and especially if you're getting a lot of early encouragement from people where they like your essays at school or they like this or they like that. The hardest thing is figuring out what to write about. Like what can
Yeah.
you write about? What can you bring to the table? Because there's enough books in the world, like I was always very cognizant of that. And so I like to describe myself as a writer of like queer supernatural suspense that's pretty much always set in Texas. And like that was just where I landed. I realized that was my wheelhouse. So it feels very weird to feel like you already kind of know exactly what you're always going to be writing, but it's also sort of liberating. So if you
Yeah.
want queer small town Texas horror or like confined claustrophobic queer Texas horror with a murder mystery, I'm your guy.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. And I think I really relate to that because I'm somebody who also like I have wheels spinning creatively, but I write mostly like reviews and like, like kind of like opinion stuff. So it's hard for me to never, if I ever think creatively, I'm always setting my stuff in Louisiana. I'm
For
always
sure.
like, it's very like Cajun centered. And so it's a very lived in space, I would imagine, for you. But I think sometimes, I don't know if you've encountered this, but like figuring out how to translate that onto the page for people who aren't from where you're from. And, like you said, you lived in New York. So have you ever kind of felt like the pressure or like had issues you think like with translating some of the things that are so like common sense to us, but maybe not to other people?
Yeah, I definitely run into that with publishing pretty much every book. It's gotten better as I've gone along. I think I've gotten better at
Yeah.
translating the weirdness of Texas to people, but I've also had editors, this is not a dig against them. A lot of editors come from East Coast backgrounds. Like in my experience, a lot of editors are just from the East Coast. A lot of times they have like a pretty comfortable upbringing as well. Like to survive in the editing world, you have to make you have to be very secure usually with parental money because you have to live in New York City
Yeah. Yeah.
on no income. I mean, like assistant editors make nothing. And then you work your way up the chain, it gets better and better. But that means you've come from a certain world. And there's nothing wrong
Hmm.
with that, but it does mean that the world I grew up in of like more not quite rural, but rural adjacent, like
Yeah.
Texas, like the fringes, you are going to just see a lot of stuff that's completely, it's amazing that we all are one country in a way. Because you just like, how can the stuff that I would see at the grocery store growing up not like that you could not compute that if you were living in the Upper West Side, right? And it's just it was fascinating. And I would get notes for editors would be like, this seems a little cartoonish or overblown, like certain descriptions
Yeah,
of
it's
like,
definitely not.
and you're just kind of like, no, but okay, let's tone it down maybe, or let's figure out a way to contextualize it better for people. But yeah, that has been a struggle. I wouldn't say it's my biggest struggle, but it's definitely something that is on my mind all the time is how if you depicted Texas accurately, if you depict the South accurately, no one will believe it. It's so
I
absurd.
know.
It's
I
so bananas.
I've run into that all the time. I mean, I was talking the other day about like Mardi Gras stuff and like babies and king cakes and
Yeah,
like all the weird shit that
exactly.
we do down here. And people are like, "You're making this up to like fuck with me." And I'm like, "No, I can assure
No.
you, I couldn't make this up if I wanted to." So I imagine Texas definitely has some of that feel to it, and I think it's really interesting that you bring up some of that texture of like what you've experienced growing up and translating it to fiction and even like the smallest things like the stuff that you see at the grocery store. But to me, it's almost like, and you write about this both in the Brightlands and the Midnight Knock. There are a couple different set pieces that I'd say, speak to that, but like small stores, local restaurants, like those kind of feels I think is really interesting. And I feel like I've heard you mention that you kind of want to be like a take one Stephen King with this kind of horror, this queer horror. And I think that your perspective from this small town, very lived in state in Texas really lends itself to that kind of exposition. Like I think about Salem's Lot, right? And you have like all these people who you get the texture of their lives, but you bring that to the table too, just in a very different style. So I kind of wanted you to elaborate on your approach to those kind of characterizations, because that was a common thread that I saw in the Brightlands and in Midnight Knock, is these really unique characters that we get to know pretty well. We kind of see their daily lives and then we see how it all goes wrong or off the rails.
I've always found like I wouldn't say I don't read horror, but it wasn't the first thing that I read growing up. I was
Yeah.
always into murder mysteries and thrillers like as a kid. And then um I got into horror, I would say later in my teens and even into my early 20s. And like God love him, Stephen King is a master. Like you do run into this style of horror the style of horror that he does where something monstrous just sort of creeps into everyday life
Hmm.
felt very relatable to me. I mean, I think as you get older, you're not necessarily encountering like cosmic evil clowns, but you do have um, you know, people die in strange ways or like weird tragedies happen or just random shit just blows in out of nowhere. I find that style of horror really compelling of really establishing a lived in world that feels real and then starting to subvert it. I find that really fun. So yeah, it is interesting. It's not that I was like setting out deliberately to imitate King,
Right.
but it was I remember writing the Brightlands specifically and thinking about how King did that really well and going back and reading, like binging him when I wrote the first draft. And the book got rewritten multiple times, but he's all over Brightlands for sure. And then Midnight Knock, I think by the time I got to that point, because I wrote that about 5 years later, um, for better and for worse, your style does kind of get baked in as an author. And so I think that whatever mix of influences and King is definitely in there, that was all kind of set. And now what I'm finding as I work on new projects is how to kind of push those boundaries that you set for yourself a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that makes a lot of sense. I'm curious, what kind of mystery and thriller were you reading before you moved into horror?
Oh man, that's a great question. I read all of the great private detective series. I
Yeah.
love and then like Jack Reacher, like the Lee Child books, those aren't quite private detectives, but kind of lone wolf hero stories. I read a ton of the British ladies. So like
Yeah.
Ruth Rendell, P.D. James, they were to me they were like high literature for my teens. Like I read them really fervently and just Yeah, especially the Barbara Vine novels. Like if you know Ruth Rendell, she was a British kind of procedural writer.
Hmm.
And then she started writing these, what we now would call domestic suspense or psychological thrillers. They were very ahead of their time. Um, and incredibly dark and very much, they're still kind of shocking to read, which is interesting. Like their depictions, especially of queer sexuality. For
Hmm.
straight women, she really nails the kind of icky creepiness of like suppression, like repressed sexuality. She nails that
Yeah.
really, really well. So those were huge for me growing up. And then I guess just somehow along the way, the horror started to bleed in. It's a really weird thing.
Yeah, I mean the same thing, almost textbook happened to me as well. I like lived and died by Karen Salter's books, like read
Yeah.
all of those like in 2 summers, and adored her stuff. And then, I felt like she did a really good job of being honest about like the violence against women. A lot of people say that it's gratuitous, but I think that it's real, like having lived in this world, like she's just writing factually. And then that kind of lent itself to horror, I think, and like exploring more of those feelings that are instituted in our reality and then, taking it somewhere else. So I definitely relate to that. But I want to pivot now and I want to definitely get in depth with the Bright Lands. I think that this book is really, really unique and smart for a couple different reasons. There's obviously, like you mentioned, as we've been talking about, this exploration of suppression, repression, small town kind of the darkest secrets hide and the shame that perpetuates in a community like that. But you do something really cool with the Bright Lands, and that's about high school football too, which I think in the South can really
Yeah.
feel like a cult in some ways. So if you want to introduce the plot of the book, we'll go from there. But I mean, the inspiration seems a little obvious for this story, but we'll also talk about that as well. So if you just want to lay the groundwork, we'll jump off from there.
Yeah, no, I mean, this book is like my baby. Like I still hold on. I still have a few first editions of the hardback. I love this book so much.
Yeah.
It came out. So the premise of the book, there's a man named Joel who is a guy in his late 20s. He's living in New York, very successful. He's really done well for himself. He has a lot of baggage. He left his small town in Texas under very bad circumstances. He's a gay man. He's still dealing with the fallout of when he came out of the closet and maybe was forced out of the closet as a teenager. And he stayed away. And he has a younger brother who's like a decade younger, um, named Dylan. And Dylan is the high school quarterback. And to Joel's mind, Dylan is kind of everything that Joel wasn't. Like he's masculine, he's, dashing, he's athletic, he's charismatic, he's all of these things that a town wants a boy to be. And so to Joel's complete surprise, one night he gets some text messages from Dylan that make him very concerned that things actually aren't so good. Like something is clearly distressing his brother really badly. And Joel decides he's going to go back to his small town and figure out what's going on and see his brother. And when he gets back, things are very clearly off and he can't figure out what it is. And then Dylan goes missing. And Joel is determined to figure out what's happened to him because he gets the feeling that the town isn't taking this seriously or that there's some people know some stuff they're not saying, specifically the high school football team that Dylan is on. And so Joel is assisted by his high school girlfriend, like when it's kind of his beard from back in high school, named Starsha, who's now a sheriff's deputy in the town. And they start poking into this. And yeah, they get the thing for me with the Brightlands, like all the way through, was that feeling that a lot of queer people have of just sort of this like nameless dread of their hometown. And a lot of that is unrooted anxiety. But I was like, well, what if actually you were right to be scared of it? What if there was actually something very dangerous waiting for you there?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting how you were able to give shape and organization like to that feeling, right? Because like I think that it's really hard whenever you don't really feel like you fit in with where you've come from. That, like you said, that anxiety, and you all eat for whatever reason, you go back. Like your family's there. There's, like you kind of have to confront it within your lifetime. And I think for Joel, it's a really unique and like very exaggerated circumstance, obviously, but I think that it just really signify. I mean, we all go through it in some way, shape, or form. I feel like if you've ever not identified fully with where you're from.
Right.
So, yeah, I think it's a really unique setup, and I wanted to talk about kind of combining that sense of, I don't know, I guess like domestic thriller, like something's not right at home, right?
Mhm.
versus the socio like I think that the biggest horror that's on display in this book is the sociological horror. And
Mhm.
you like there's some, hints and sprinkles of some other kinds of horror that I don't want to spoil too much, but what's it like to marry those two? Because I feel like sometimes it can be very easy to do that and sometimes it can be not so easy.
So what was weird about this book, it went through like multiple massive rewrites because it was my first novel, and that
Yeah.
there's really I had written a draft of another book, but this was my first real stab of like from top to bottom taking what I had learned and making a book happen. Um, and it was, you only learn it by doing it. And so it had a ton of plot in the first draft. It had a ton of plot. And it was actually not explicitly horror. Like this is the part that's so weird. The first draft was basically a police procedural,
Yeah.
but it had all of these elements of unease. There was something weird about it. There was this weird vibe. And there were certain images and symbols that kept recurring throughout the text of like circles, holes in the ground, like this weird vibe that, and I couldn't put my finger on it, but I reread it multiple times and I was just like, there's something here. And then, that first draft, I think it was like almost 550 pages. It was a huge doorstop. And I was lucky to have an agent at the time. And he told me like, I can't take this out. This is way too long for a debut. At the most I can send out is 120,000 words, which meant I needed to cut about 40,000 words, which is over 100 pages. I mean, it's a huge rewrite. And what I was struggling with in that rewrite is the way that I wanted the plot to move between different character POVs. So we get a lot of different kind of like a round robin thing. Like it's always
Yeah.
bouncing between different people. And I never wanted to have two of the same character chapters right after each other. So you're always ending on cliffhangers, right? And like moving
Mhm.
around the story. What was tricky was that sometimes there would be something going on across town that wasn't as interesting as what you just left the reader with. And that's a problem. Like you don't want to let the tension slacken too much. And what I found was really interesting is by adding these supernatural elements, by making this unease more explicit and adding in these things that everybody's kind of experiencing, it allows you to create tension where there's really none on the page.
Yeah.
So it was kind of like, originally it was almost like a device just to get the plot tighter. And then what I found as I went along is it gave the book, it made me a horror novelist, which I never necessarily set out to do. Like that came as a surprise. But it also allowed me to make a really, like a kind of book that I'd never quite seen before of
Yeah.
like a big multi-character procedural with, this mounting horror. And so what I think is so fun about horror specifically is like in crime writing, you can have your themes. You can have like your sociological themes, but if you make them too explicit, it feels preachy or cheesy. And there's a lot of kind of issue novels from like the 80s into the aughts that just feel very clunky to read nowadays because they're so clearly, like Karen Slaughter was very deft at this. There's writers
Mhm.
who are much clumsier at it. Um, what's cool about horror is that you can make those themes completely explicit and dial them up to 11 and have kind of a gory fun with it. And I think that's what was fun for me with this book was like, okay, I can have my themes of like the way a society doesn't just repress sexuality, but really forces men to be a certain type of man and really forces people to care about sports and to care about, team spirit and all that. It was fun to see how I could use horror to just ratchet all of that up.
Yeah. Well, and I think to your point about kind of how it tightens everything up a bit without having to like spell it out on the page is it's always that unknown threat, right? Like until the very end. And even then, like we don't 100% know. Like there's still
Mhm.
some mystery to what's going on, but that it could be anywhere at any time. It could, like we don't know the rules by which we're playing, I think really adds to the atmosphere of unease. And we obviously know that something's wrong from Joel's perspective and his worry about Dylan, but that kind of just expands into the whole town whenever we see the way that Dylan's friends are, acting about his predicament. And really, the football team doesn't really spend a lot of time concerned with Dylan. They move on rather quickly.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a really unique choice. And I think it felt very emblematic of a lot of things about whether it's the attitudes of where people's focus is on, the lack of actual regard that we have for people and, like what an athlete can like the entertainment value of a person, like
Mm.
I think that's a super interesting like piece of horror that I don't think has been tapped into fully yet. This is,
Mm.
the Brightlands definitely has, but I think that there's something really, really horrific about using people like that and kind of like the pawnship of whether it's like athletes, entertainment, celebrities, that kind of thing. And I wondered how it felt for you to write that, to kind of explore that. Because I've seen it happen, I went to LSU. I mean, how many star athletes get injured and their life and their career is over. They have nothing else to fall back on. And like everybody,
Mm.
the vitriol that we see on social media and things like that, like it's such a wild field of
Mhm.
horror, in my opinion.
No, there's nothing like it. I mean, that's what's so strange. How to explain it? Football always made me really sad as a kid, and I
Yeah.
could never quite pin down why. And it made me uncomfortable just because growing up gay, I think we're a little adverse to physical violence. You're a
Yeah.
little skittish about it. But there was a deeper melancholy to it, and I could never
Mhm.
quite pin it down. And I think some of it is the fact that it's happening in like autumn, so it's very, autumnal, like the leaves are falling. It was just always like sad coded. It felt very melancholy to me. And I think even as a young person, I was dumb in a lot of ways, but I think I had a pretty good grasp on the way that we are going to get older and like that, things don't last forever. And when you apply that mindset to high school football, it makes it very sad because you have these kids who are turned into these huge celebrities. And some of these towns, they're really powerful. Like a lot of people know kids like this who become very important in their town and then fade away very, very quickly. And the movie Friday Night Lights is a pretty decent representation of the book. And then the TV show is very kind of soap opera. Like it's much more romantic. And I guess we need to talk about Friday Night Lights because that was always kind of in mind with it. Like my agent, when I first pitched him on the idea of a murder mystery in a small Texas town where the quarterback gets murdered, he was like, "Oh, it's Friday Night Lights meets Twin Peaks. Like, I want to sell
Yeah.
that book. Like, write me that book, please." And that was really helpful. But then I was like, I guess I need to go read Friday Night Lights. And like, it's an astonishingly bleak book. Like,
Yeah.
it doesn't get enough credit for how dark it is and how sad it is. And there's this insanely haunting chunk at the end, the epilogue, where the team that we've been following through their senior year, they all get erased off of the playboard and new people's names are getting written in and new injuries are getting prepared for. And like everybody just is moving on. And they've made these kids so big and now they're gone. And the other influence, and this is really weird, is the Netflix show The Crown
Oh
and
yeah.
about the British royal family. And the way that that show depicts the crown itself, like the throne, as this machine that's just gobbling these people up for its own purposes. And the tragedy of that show is it's completely irrelevant, more or less. Like the royal family is just increasingly unnecessary and even like kind of disdained. And yet this machine keeps churning. And I was interested in that. Like England has the Royal Court of Japan is really weird. There's all of these places where these machines are established for a larger purpose and the fuel that runs them is the people inside of them. And so, yeah, football. You can do everything with football. You can
You
explore
can, yeah.
anything with this really bleak sport. And then, yeah, just I knew how violent it was because tangentially, I had a friend in high school who um, I quit going to my high school and homeschooled for my last 2 years. So I sort of lost contact with a bunch of people. And then I caught up with them again at like college, weirdly enough. And so one of them was a guy who'd played, and I didn't know anything about this. When I first saw him, he had his arm in a sling. And I was like, what happened? He had tackled the guy and somehow a button on that guy's jersey had caught on his sleeve and basically
Oh
twisted his
no.
arm all the way around and like completely tore the socket, like tore all the cartilage, all the tendons, everything. And so his arm would just randomly pop out of the socket and he'd have to like, yeah, get somebody to pop it back in. And you have to like bite down on a belt and just reset it. And it's like, And then he got fixed finally. Like he had to wait until somebody died with a genotype of cartilage, like where their genotype matched.
Oh,
And
for
then
the transfer.
he got a cartilage plug put in. But he had to wait for a person to die to get this. And I was just like, this is the most deranged. Like, why do we let kids do this? Like, why do we put them through this?
I know. And I think about that too. I feel like I could talk about like the horror of any sport, but like really down here, is football. But like and speaking of like cycles, that's a big part of this book. Like you were talking about like the symbolism of like this hole in the ground that is hungry for whatever. We can talk about like cyclical nature of how this keeps feeding itself. But there are so many high school kids who like this is their life and for what? Like they don't go on to play college ball, or if they do go play college ball, it's not so like the importance that is kind of instituted and the how we celebrate them and treat them on this level of adolescence and how like it's false. Like it doesn't prepare you for real life, like the real
Mm-hmm.
world. And it just feels like a lie that you perpetuate. I mean, we just see like, you have characters in your book that like they were the king of the field. Like they were, and then like how many years later they're living in really poor conditions. There's addiction. There's, like all these different things that like we care for 4 years and then what? You
Yeah.
know, that feels
Yeah. And even
especially
that,
horrific.
and sometimes it's just 2 years, like you go from JV to varsity. Wow,
Yeah.
you got your 2 years in the sun. Yeah, I remember when I was researching the book and like kind of doing the early outline of it. I was in New York and randomly like ESPN 3 was showing the Texas state semifinal football game in
Hmm.
the Dallas Cowboys Stadium. And so my roommate and I watched it, and she was from the Midwest, but so she knew a little bit of it, but she was like riveted by like the pageantry and the bananas-ness of it, where you have two high school teams from Bumble, nowhere,
Yeah.
dragged into Dallas, Texas, and like one of the biggest stadiums in the world. And the game was just a bloodbath. Like one team just got absolutely destroyed. And you could see the hope on these kids' faces just dying like live on air. Oh my God, it haunts me to this day. And I was like, this is insane. Like these kids should not be celebrities. They're way too young. Like celebrity is like I am nowhere near a celebrity, but I have a sliver of notoriety, and I would
Hmm.
not have been able to handle that at 18, let
Yeah.
alone 16. It's crazy. It's crazy.
It is. And I think, whenever you have friends or like, my husband had younger brothers who were like really big football players and then like they ended up not, pursuing that beyond high school, but like seeing how much of their time and like how beat up they were after like
Yeah,
I was like, oh yeah, I can't go do anything this weekend. I gotta like ice and rest, like that kind of
it's
thing. It's just,
crazy.
it's wild to think about. But I want to pivot a little bit more away from the sports horror
Absolutely.
and more to the horror of the town. You do a really good job of juggling kind of how this town's mentality and priorities affects everybody, not just like the men and the toxic masculinity of this town, but like how it affects girlfriends, moms, like this really, really wide arching attitude that this town carries. What was it like to kind of like juggle that perspective amongst so many characters? Like, was that a challenge for you to like kind of let that play out, or did it feel really easy? Because, like we've kind of grown up around it. So I mean, it's not like, we're pulling this out of a hat.
I think it was pretty easy with this book. A lot of these characters were kind of from fragments of stories that I had written growing up and in my 20s. And like there's a scene that I won't spoil, but there's a scene between uh, Joel and a character named Troy. And it's like a flashback to when they were kids, and a pickup truck going mudding. And like I had written that probably when I was like 21, maybe 20, 21, like early. And I never knew what to do with it. It was a really evocative sort of moment, but it didn't work as a short story. Um, and also parenthetically, if people are learning how to write, like don't try to write short stories. They're really hard. If you're not naturally good at short stories, just write novels. Trust me. Like short fiction is brutally difficult.
It is.
Like
You got to be punchy, man. You got to know timing like nobody's business.
you got to know timing. You got to have such a depth. Like I'm 30, about to be 35. I feel like I just now maybe got enough life experience to try a short piece. Like you have to really have some life under your belt, I think, to write short fiction because you have to be so precise and so
Yeah.
impactful. Anyway, free advice for the day. But like,
I'll take
I
it.
yeah, right. But so with the Brightlands, it was very easy because I had all of these characters. And also I was kind of homesick. I
Yeah.
hated a lot about Texas. And you don't quite realize, I think it's really valuable for anybody, but especially a writer, to leave their home for a while and see it from the outside. And then for all that I liked about New York, I was homesick. And so once I tapped into it, the hard part was reining it in. Like I said, like that first draft was really long. And like, I think my agent thought I was on meth or something because I wrote it really fast. And like, it was this big bloated monster. The challenge was actually constraining it, like I said earlier. The characters, oh my God, there's like characters that cut from the Brightlands that I still think about that are going to
Yeah.
come back somewhere. They would just walk in and start talking. It was a dream of a book. It was very challenging in a lot of ways. The characters were never a hard struggle with this one.
Yeah, that's really interesting. But I think like we've said, with the landscape as rife as this one, like that makes a lot of sense. And the last like big talking point I want to talk about with this book is the end of this book. And I don't want to spoil it, but it is like a
Please.
huge centerpiece of like explain it. You answer so many questions. And I hate to say that it's satisfying because it's really sad and upsetting to see like the way that it plays out. And there's like a lot of violence that ends up, being involved and things like that. But like, did you always know that that was where that was going? Like, was that the first thing that you knew and then you built everything around it? Or like how did you land on that being the big reveal at the end, I guess is my question.
God, I wish I knew how to come up with a banger idea because if I did, I would do it every time. Like it's such a weird alchemy of stuff. I remember
Mhm.
walking out of my agent's office when we had kind of had this talk where I was like, Friday Night Lights meets Twin Peaks. Like I kind of had the idea in his office, like hopped up on espresso. His intern kept bringing espresso shots. And like by the end of that meeting, I was like bouncing off the walls. And remember I remember walking down the subway platform, like walking down to a subway platform, completely lost. And by the time the train arrived, which was probably 15 minutes after I left the office, I had the title in my head of the Brightlands, and I had no idea what it meant. Um, but pretty quickly, as I started to think about football and think about um, just some of the weird stories I heard growing up, man, I heard so many weird stories. And then especially when I left my hometown and moved to Austin, I lived in Austin for a good while, and I live there again now. I met a lot of boys like at the gay clubs who were kind of like me, like refugees from the countryside.
Yeah.
And they just had so many crazy stories. And there was this one guy I knew who was a high school football player. And he was like out kind of like he was hooking up with people in high school, but he had some weird run-ins with the cops and weird run-ins with like other people on the team and adults in town. And, it was spooky. Like he had some really strange stories and I picked up other stuff here and there. And very quickly, I realized what the Brightlands were. I don't know if I would have the guts to write it at this age. I think that's the kind of thing you write when you're 26, 27. Like I was very angry and very, I don't know, very much wanted to like make a really big swing. And so once I had the idea for it, and I talked about it with a few people and everybody was really excited about it. Everybody was really enthusiastic about this premise of where the book would go. Yeah, I knew that everybody had to end up there. I knew that
Yeah.
that needed to be the end point. And one of my favorite movies, like maybe my favorite movie of all time, is Mad Max Fury Road, the
Yeah.
remake from like 2018. And like it, or 2014, it has, for my money, the most elegant story in terms of just every character is so distinct. Every plot line is so clear. The action is never slackens except when you really need it to. And then it doesn't last very long. Like, and it's a perfectly straight line. I rewatched that movie over and over, especially the final chase sequence, like the last 20-ish minutes of that movie. Because for my money, it's the best climax of a movie, maybe that I've ever seen. And I loved the way that George Miller makes sure that every single piece on the table gets used.
Yeah.
And that was really big with me for the Brightlands. Once you get out there and you know what's going on and you realize all the party members involved, and you also realize just everything about it was so much fun. The setting, you could do so much with the setting. You can do so much with the characters. You can do so much with the guns that show up. Like, and I wanted every single piece of it to play into it, even very small minor characters. So yeah, I would say that I spent about of the time that it took me to write the book, more than half of it was getting the ending right.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think it's probably one of the most like perfect amalgamations of like what it feels like to like live in a place that thrives on denial, that would just like literally rather shove everything wherever else. And like that's kind of what like it's literally shoved out into a field in the middle of nowhere and you
Yep.
don't talk about it anymore. So I thought it was a really brilliant choice to kind of frame it the way that you did. And the not only that, but like, we get a little bit before the shit like really hits the fan, we get a little bit of exposition of like what a normal night at the Brightlands is like. And I thought that that was it was, I mean, it was heartbreaking, but it was so interesting to see, like that full exploration on the page. And it was some of the most like upsetting, like truly like some of the most interpersonal horror that I think that I saw on the page was like in those moments of like uncovering like what is actually going on and the amount of denial and just exploitation that's going on and everything else. I mean, there's
Mhm.
so many things, but no, true
One thing
true
that's
horror.
interesting, and I think as I've gotten older, I find it more and more horrifying. And I was always grossed out by it, but like I was always frightened by it. But what's really interesting is a lot of queer readers, especially male queer people, describe this really intense ambivalence about the book where they're like, it's also kind of hot. Like there's an element of this that's kind of sexy. And
Hmm.
that I think was the secret sauce for me is I was like, this is like it's bad on a lot of levels, but there's also certain people who are getting a lot of fun out of it and
Yeah.
they have to pay a pretty steep price for it, but they're getting something out of it. And that just there was so much I was able to say about queer culture and the way men abuse men and the way
Yeah.
cycles of violence continue. Yeah, it's weird, man. Listen, I wish I could have it every book because like it's once in a decade maybe you get an idea where you can say all you want to say in one place.
Well, I think that you're so right though, because it's like this weird mixture of like relief of like, oh, maybe these people can be who they really are without fear of whatever, but like also how heartbreaking that these are the circumstances that this is,
Mhm.
expressed in this way. And so it's this weird like yin and yang of like, oh, okay, we can be who we want to be, but God, doesn't it fucking suck that
Yeah,
it's with all of these caveats and this like these rules and this, there's people being taken advantage of and, all these things. So no,
a
I
pound
think
of
it's,
flesh. Yeah, the price is
yeah,
pretty steep. It's rough.
yeah, it's so, so interesting to think about. And I think about it quite often since I've read it. Okay, but I want to pivot now too. I want to talk about The Midnight Nocturne, which is your most recent release. And I feel like you leaned a little bit more like sci-fi Twilight Zone-y horror with
Mhm.
this one. So do you want to go ahead and introduce the plot of this one and then we'll kind of unpack it a little bit.
Okay, so if the Brylands is hard to talk about without spoiling, Midnight Knock is I don't know what I did to myself with this book. Like it so it at the beginning you're introduced to a group of travelers, specifically two men and two women. So you have a guy, Ethan and Hunter. They've only known each other for a minute, but they seem pretty passionately in love with each other. They've got kind of a Bonnie and Clyde thing. They're on the run from a crime. Ethan is a pretty nice guy, but he inherited his mom's auto shop in kind of a dying town, and nothing has worked out for him since. And Hunter has given him maybe a way out, but with a very high price. And so Ethan's on the run, but we don't really know the details of what's going on with them. And then there's also two women, Kyla and Fernanda, who are on the run from a pretty dangerous criminal kind of kingpin in the West Texas desert. We don't know what's going on with them, but they're on the run. They're in trouble too. They arrive at a motel in the middle of nowhere, like the absolute middle of nowhere on a very, very, very cold night. And some other people arrive. There's another woman at the hotel, at the motel, who already knows everybody there. And it starts to very quickly become obvious that like everybody here has something they're desperate to hide. And this woman seems to somehow know what it is for everyone, or at least to have some connection to all of them. in a way that sort of beggars belief. Like the coincidences just keep stacking up. And a character even says, when you look at everybody who's here, it's not really a question of if somebody is going to get hurt. It's a question of who. And so somebody is murdered, and the twins who run the motel, who are their own very weird couple,
Yeah, super
they
weird.
they tell the guests that this grave crime has been committed on their land, and the guests have until midnight to find who did it, or else they will all die. And everybody's like, y'all are crazy. And they said, well, at midnight, the lights around this place are going to go out, and the things that live in the desert are going to come in. And your best shot is hiding with us, and we will take the innocent to safety and leave the guilty to die, or you can all stay out here. And so that's sort of the initial kickoff of the book. And, the characters are rightly a little dubious of this, and it feels a little pat, but also somebody does try to leave, and it goes very badly for him. So we know there is something out in the dark. We know that there is a murderer somewhere. Somebody here was a murderer. And they start trying to investigate it. And that's about the most you can say about this book. Because after that, it starts to go into some... And the way that I think The Brightlands is very ambitious from a sense of like, oh my God, I can't believe I put that on the page. Like, I can't believe I depicted some of this stuff on the page. Midnight Knock took years off my life because the plot just gets so incredibly bizarre, and like there's a lot of echoes, I guess we should say. The plot echoes in a big way, and there's a big twist that everybody loves, that everybody knows when they've read the book. Like about a third of the way through, there's this one moment that everybody will talk to me about, and it's fun. But it was one of those twists where I wrote it and I was like, ooh, that's really good, that's really juicy. And then kind of later, the hangover kicks in and you're like, what have I done? Like, how am I going to make this make sense?
That makes sense. No, I get it. I think that my biggest thing that I was thinking about when I was reading it, I was so impressed. I was like, there has to be a whiteboard or like a cork board with red string everywhere, like keeping all of this together because I was really impressed with the echo aspect that you mentioned of this book. And, you do the same thing that you kind of did in The Brightlands with all these different characters who are very distinct in their own way and like having their own demons, but again, there's a thread of commonality between all of them as we learn. But it's interesting that the claustrophobia of the Midnight Knock really lends itself to the story in the same way that it does with the Brightlands, but there's just like a little bit more room to breathe, right?
Mhm.
We're talking
Yeah.
about a whole town compared to
Yeah.
a motel, so to speak, and that echo component. So what did you feel the claustrophobia when you were writing this? Like
Oh,
what was the
God.
writing experience like for you to kind of set it so limitedly, I guess is the way to say.
Well, what I found really interesting was the idea of big open space claustrophobia, because that's
Yeah.
something about Texas, and especially West Texas, because I went to West Texas first as a teenager. And again, being a very moody teenager, I was struck by the scale of it. And like, it was the first time I realized how small I was, like in the universe, how small you are when you see these massive landscapes. And like, even back in the time of the Native Americans, like it was still mostly unpopulated, like huge chunks of territory where people would pass through it. But oh my God, it's a lot of space just to move around. And especially at night and especially in the winter, it gets really cold out there and really dark. And I remember when I was writing, I had the idea. And so I did a research trip. Like I drove out there and I spent the first night in a little town called Sanderson. And it was nothing against Sanderson and nothing against this motel. It was a perfectly nice motel. The sense of oppressive quiet that just settles on you in the middle of
Yeah.
nowhere, and the fact that you couldn't see outside, like it was so dark, you literally couldn't see very far past the lights. You could see the stars, and that was about it, but they weren't illuminating much. And the cold was so unbelievably brutal that night. And I remember just sitting in my quiet motel room genuinely afraid to go out, like genuinely checking the locks and just kind of getting in my own head. And some of that is just you're getting in the zone of the book as well. And I was reading, I'll never forget it. I was reading I'm Thinking of Ending Things by Ian Reid.
Oh God, what a book
Yeah.
to be reading then. Oh
And
man.
it's one of the only books that I was so creeped out I had to put it down. I was like,
Yeah.
this is genuinely fucking with my head. I can't do this. It really scared me. And I remember spending most of that night, and I'm not the kind of, like, I like to put my phone away. I don't like to have my phone in bed. Like I try really hard to keep the screen over there. I found myself on the phone, just like I found one corner of my room that had one bar of signal, and just being on YouTube watching like shitty 360-bit like videos because the compression rate was so bad, because the data was so bad, and doing that until like 2 or 3 in the morning when I finally just was exhausted and passed out. Yeah, I tried to carry that feeling into the book of like, you have all this space, but there's nowhere to go.
Yeah, no, it that atmosphere is definitely there. And I think that it's so I think the motel scene, I think for whatever reason, and I'm a big X-Files nerd, so like, especially whenever Mulder and Scully travel, they stay in a
Yeah.
motel, and that's whenever, like all the weird shit happens, right? So to me, like as soon as you as we set this in a motel and I was like, oh, this has already got some like ingrained kind of like Americana,
Mhm.
wayward travelers, people on the road, but what destination in mind? And then you add the components that you just described, particularly with West Texas, that just abundance of room, but like nobody to hear you scream is so, so unnerving.
Yeah.
Yeah, but so there's that like isolated component, but I think what is really interesting is the dynamics between all the characters because there's like almost a mystery in and of itself with every kind of grouping that you have introduced to the motel. So like in particular, the two that stick out in my mind are um Kyla and Fernanda, what
Mhm.
was yeah, okay.
Fernando, yeah.
And yeah, and then Ethan and Hunter. They really kind of take center stage in my mind with they're running from something or trying to run to something and
Mhm.
what it is we don't really know. And I think that that was a really interesting choice to kind of give them so much interpersonal kind of conflict and, baggage with one
Mhm.
another.
Mhm.
Um, how did that feel to write like that interiority with the exteriority of this like grander plot at play within the motel and like what's going on?
In the same way that I think I could only have written The Brightlands as a 27-year-old, like a 26,
Yeah.
27-year-old, I think I could only write this as someone who has a couple novels under his belt. Like
Yeah.
it does just take a lot. I'm nowhere near an expert, but I did feel like I'd kind of hit a level up on this one where I'm like, there's just a lot of technical know-how and kind of you learn as you go the balance, like the sense of proportion of how much interior, how much exterior, how much like inter-character drama do I need on the page versus how much horror do I need on the page? Like,
Yeah.
how do I balance all those elements? I think that just comes with practice, honestly. And you said that was there like a cork board or a whiteboard? It literally was just like a sheet of paper where I wrote out the times that everything happened,
Okay, yeah.
and I would just reference that as I was going through it because on the one hand, you do want to have a very structured plot, but if you over structure yourself, you can rob yourself of those interpersonal character moments. You can rob yourself of that interiority because there's definitely books that I think we've all read where it's clear the author wrote a very extensive outline and they're just like checking off a list to get
Yeah.
through it. And I don't know, I think that you do still need to have some of that sense of discovery and exploration. So there were elements of the characters that I kind of deliberately didn't figure out ahead of time so that I could figure it out as I went, which is an insane way to work because you'll realize something on page 300. That means you have to rewrite page 217. But then if that happens, then this character doesn't know this other thing. Like it was yeah, it was like running around pushing bubbles down on wallpaper or something. Like every time you'd fix
Yeah.
one thing, another thing would pop up. It was a wild experience.
That makes sense. But you're working with a pretty wide cast and like again, all I don't want to say all violent, but all people who have like grit to them is the way that I
Yeah.
would describe this book. Like there's a Western feel to Midnight Knock to me, not just for its sense of, location, but like to the personality of a lot of the people that we're dealing with here. And I do want to commend you for the weird twins that run the motel. They just like they kind of like give you a moment. I don't want to say like a brevity because it wasn't like funny, but it was like, oh, we're really weird. Like we're really in strange territory now because of
It's
this
like the David
strange.
Lynch moment, I think.
Yeah,
Like
exactly.
David
That
Lynch always,
uncanny.
yeah, that uncanny thing where like, am I supposed to laugh? I don't know if I'm supposed to laugh. Like I'm a little weirded out right now. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
that very much worked in this book, I think, and kind of helped to ease some of the tension because it is like a very high tension book for as it goes. And I want to talk in broad terms here, but how did you decide on the big swing that was gonna land this book where it is? Because it takes a turn that I was like, oh hell yeah, let's go. Like let's see what we can see, let's do what we can do. Like,
Yeah.
I love whenever, especially right now, whenever authors are breaking a formula. I love whenever like you kind of set this as a locked room mystery and then you're like kind of like fuck it. Like we're making our own rules, you know what I mean?
Yes.
So what did it feel like to kind of come upon the realization of what was really going on
Mhm.
and kind of planning for that, I guess, is the best way to put it.
So many of my books, or at least the ones that wind up getting written, they do kind of come out of this weird, like foggy landscape. Like it's sort of a
Mhm.
vision in my head, and I don't necessarily see the whole thing, but I see like maybe a specific mood or a moment or like a setting. And the idea, like the initial idea for Midnight Knock was a highway in West Texas that literally never ended. Like you get
Mhm.
trapped on this highway and then you're stuck on it. And it had such a nice, eerie, like urban legend feel to it. And
Yeah.
then I was like, all right, well, you need a novel. Like this isn't a novel. Like this is a really cool like, premise. And I was like, okay, everybody's got to stop somewhere. They're going to run out of gas. They're going to need shelter. So maybe there's a motel out in the middle of nowhere. And then I had the image of the motel, and the motel in my mind always had a creepy house behind it, like in Psycho or something. And it always had this big mountain that was just standing all by itself. And it's so weird. Like I knew that these characters were going to save the world. Like that this was like bigger than just a mystery, that this was like a world-saving moment. And I think a lot of that, like I grew up playing like a lot of video games, especially
Yeah.
like RPGs, like Final Fantasy and stuff, where it's like
Yeah.
it starts small and then by the end you're like a group of friends battling God. And you're just like, this is so weird. Like only the Japanese could make this epic and work and so absurd at the same time. So I think yeah, there was a bit of like Final Fantasy, a bit of Elden Ring, like a bit of these like big epic sort of video games were in there. And then also just this, yeah, a real wish to break, like push the mold. Like every book for me should be fresh, ideally. Like you
Mhm.
need to find something new. And I think too, I was getting, so my second book, the one we haven't talked about is called No Road Home. It is a very classic country house locked room mystery. And rather than demolishing the boundaries, it just kind of gets so deep and dark. It enters this very perverse territory. And I was like, I don't think I can go any more inward. Like, I think I've
Mhm.
done that. Because like that book is very much about um, cycles of violence, cycles of like family madness, like these kinds of very gothic themes. And I was
Yeah.
like, that book is very interior. It just keeps going in and back and back and back, like into the past. Like it just keeps going deeper into the past. With this one, I was like, yeah, I want something more expansive. And it was a really fun, like kind of bet you set with yourself where it's like, can you do it? Like, can we really nail this? And so, yeah, once I knew that they were going to save the world, it was just a matter of figuring out like what the hell that meant. And then figuring out how the hell you're going to sell it. Because some people love it and some people hate it. It's been
It's
great. Like
so
the response has been
it's
wild.
I know it's so strange to me, and this is a little bit of a tangent, but you know, I know so many people like you and I who kind of got their start in enjoying mystery and thriller, right? And there's a formula that works for those books. But to me, you kind of either figure out the formula or you get tired of the formula. And I feel like that was like when I really made my jump to horror. I was like, I'm ready to kind of like not color inside the lines,
Yeah,
like I'm
for
ready
sure.
to see what else is out there. And so I think it's hilarious because I've seen it happen in some other books that are kind of, they're marketed in kind of both areas. They're both kind of horror, they're both kind of murder mystery thriller, that kind of dynamic. And the response is just so wildly different. Like for instance, A Flesh and Blood by N.L. Lavin and Hunter Burke came out last year with Crooked Lane Books, and it's a book that is set in Louisiana,
Mhm.
and it's about like it's called The Cajun Cannibal, and it's a serial killer story, but it ends up taking a turn into some other, and I fucking loved it. And the people, like the horror people I recommended it to, loved it as well. But every thriller reader that I talked to about it it was not for them. And I'm like, I wonder what it is about like opening your mind to the other or the whatever. Like, at what
Mhm.
point do we hit that we're ready to get there
I think
versus the
that
people that aren't? I don't know. It's so strange to me.
the murder mystery community, like especially like the procedural and the thriller style of mystery, like it's a comfort pick in a lot of ways because it
Yeah.
is predictable. Like there are beats that are predictable. And um, there's a project that I have a book coming out in the summer that we haven't announced yet that is much more predictable in a fun way. Like it's very much in a particular genre, and there's a comfort to that for sure. You know what you're getting into with that book. I think the unease that you can have with a book like mine that I've written so far, you don't know what you're signing up for. And that can be really daunting for some people. Or they can feel betrayed because they were expecting a certain type of story. They were expecting a certain type of feeling. I love the sense that a story is moving in drastically different. Have you read Out by Natsuo Kirino? It's the Japanese
I have
thriller.
not. No,
Oh my God. Yeah.
I need
Next time
to.
you're reading a thriller, it's probably one of the best thrillers ever written. I mean, it's structurally perfect. And it's about a woman who kills her husband and gets the women she works with at like a boxed lunch factory to help her
Yeah.
dispose of the body. And you think, oh God, is this going to be about cannibalism? Like, where is this going? And there's just this amazing bit about two-thirds of the way in where they realize they can make a business out of this. And it moves in this wildly different direction. Like the Yakuza get involved and
Oh,
like
that sounds wonderful.
crazy sadomasochistic cat and mouse with this man. Like it's wild. It's such a phenomenal book. And I remember reading it as a kid, like way too young. Like that book goes, again, talk about like, oh my God. I should not have read that at 15. But I just remember the thrill. Like I was about to go to bed, and I love that feeling as a reader where you're about to go to bed, you're getting tired, and then you turn the page and you're like, wait, what?
Yeah, we're not
We're
gonna go
gonna
to
do
sleep now.
this? Oh
Yeah.
my God. Yeah. Fuck sleep. Like this is me. This is the rest of my night. So I always strive for that feeling, but I understand. I have learned to understand where people are coming from, where they're like, I was expecting a small town murder mystery. I was expecting kind of a locked room Western or like motel mystery. And instead I got this. Like,
I guess my only caveat to that kind of thinking though is like, it's because I have a psychology background, the whole entire appeal that I think a lot of people have with a murder mystery is like they want to explore the not usual. They want to explore the deviant. They want to kind of take a closer look at whatever. But I think that a lot of people have a lot of restrictions to the deviancy that they want to explore or the
exactly.
otherness that they want to explore. And I think it's just super fascinating to me where those boundaries lie and like what we're comfortable with. Because like at this point, I just don't give a shit. Like cannibalism, you name it, I'm
Yeah.
there. I just don't like I think it's great to explore any and everything. Um, but again, Anna, I don't know, however many years ago, would not have been on board with that. She would have been like, what the fuck? So I just think it's really interesting how our boundaries kind of grow and change and whether they don't, with something like this. But I'm always looking to like find something original. I want to be surprised. I want, I really love a big swing,
Mhm.
in that direction. So
No, I agree. I'm always amazed by it's such a, it sounds ironic that you would read horror as a comfort pick, like as a
yeah.
comfort read, or that you would read, especially murder mysteries as a comfort read, but I get it for some people. Yeah, no, not to spoil, but one of my books, like incest is a major theme. Like, and like I was really interested. Like, yeah, it's icky, but it's like interesting. Like it's been around forever. What does it say? Like, what can you do with that metaphorically? What can you do with that structurally? The revulsion that that book was like the way that that book it just I wrote that book, and then when I wrote another book, we were approached by one of the big book clubs. They wanted to read the new book, and they were like, we just have to ask that there's no incest in this one, right? And I was like, wow, I never would have thought that would be like, it's not fun. Like I'm not because I want to read it necessarily, but it's like it is what that story is, and there's some interesting stuff you can explore there. The way that people were like, oh God, no, I can't handle that, chief. I was like, really?
That's the way that I feel. I feel like cannibalism is having a big moment. I've kind of been like talking with it about a few people about it recently, and that's the thing that's on my mind. But it's not that I want to read about people eating
Mhm.
people. I think it's a wonderful vehicle for exploring like consumption and the hunger for the things that we cannot, attain like as a country, like sociological, like all of these things in the same way that incest really explores, I think, like comfort in strange places and like unideal connections and where those connections are formed or why those connections are like all those big picture things are really interesting to explore with the taboo, but some people I just don't think are ready to go
I
there
think what it is,
yet.
and this is my like takeaway thought, I think some people aren't ready to confront how commonplace a lot of this stuff is.
That too,
Like,
yeah.
I think that's something with the Brightlands, the way that where that book goes. I think a lot of people just did not want to, especially respectfully, a lot of straight women readers did not want
Yeah.
to deal with how common the sexual violence depicted in that book takes place versus
Yeah.
queer readers, queer men almost universally all have a story, either to us or to people we are very close to. Um, yeah, the incest thing, it was just like someone that I knew he told me about how someone in his family had had sex with their sister, and it was like, and it had happened repeatedly, and it was deeply weird, like it wasn't healthy for these people, but it made me realize like it's not that uncommon. And the Midnight Knock, I think, has its own, it's not as sexually deviant, it's more like plot shenanigans, like how many genres can we fit into one book kind of thing. But yeah, I think that a lot of people just don't want to deal with the fact that certain things exist. And I find that really fun to kind of poke their buttons.
Me too. I was about to say that makes me want to like read more of it, and it makes me like want writers to keep writing it because I think it's important to kind of like go where we're not comfortable. I think if you get too comfortable, you end up in a bad spot. But my own 2 cents on that.
Yeah, really.
Yeah, but no, I really enjoyed the Midnight Knock and where it ended up landing, and it was really an emotional ending. I'm not gonna lie, like, it
Yeah.
really kind of like I was like, whoo, wasn't expecting to have the feelings that I was feeling in that way
Yeah.
with who I was having them with at the end of that book. So
Oh, I know the
kudos
scene you're
for
talking about. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, there's two scenes in that book with those characters. There's one at the very beginning in a diner, like a little
Hmm.
diner. There's a scene there, and then yeah, the scene with them at the very end of the book.
Yes.
I had to get up and walk around the house whenever I would revise it. Like it would just make me so. The first one is probably the scariest thing I've ever written, and then, or at
Hmm.
least the most like taut. And then
Very tense, yeah. Very
yeah, and
tense.
then the sequence at the end is easily the most moving thing I've ever done. And yeah, it was really. I remember even as I wrote it, I was like, oh, this is good. You don't get that a lot. Like most of the time, you're just writing like you're like, oh God, like I don't know what's happening here. But that was one of those rare bits where you're like, oh, yep, yep. Mariel Spark described she took it was like taking dictation from God. And I was like, yep, yep, we're just transcribing this. And then, yeah, not to toot my own horn, because like, again, most of my books, they take a ton of revision and I'm still never quite satisfied with them. But yeah, that scene, it makes me very happy that the response to that scene has been very nice because it meant a lot
Yeah.
to me.
Well, I think with the people involved and the stories that you're telling, it was really moving to have kind of like two sides of the coin. Like in the beginning, this is where we start, and then in the end, this is where we're at kind of
Yeah.
thing. So it was really, really moving. But no, I really enjoyed both their books and I'm really excited to see what you have going on next. And I don't know what you're allowed to talk about. I don't ever want to get anybody in trouble, but are you
Nothing.
allowed to are you allowed to say anything about what your 2026 looks like?
No, not a word.
Ugh, damn.
It is, yeah, it is heavily under wraps. I will be able to talk about it much later. But there is a book coming. So follow my socials. Definitely follow my Instagram. That's basically, I say socials plural. I just post on Instagram. Like I can't be bothered with threads, and Twitter's a dumpster fire, and Blue
No, don't
Skies, whatever it is.
do not do not if you don't have to go on threads, don't go on threads. It's
Yeah,
not
it's just
the
it's
right
turned into
place.
Twitter again. It just reminds me of like the period of Twitter where everybody was just like a bunch of blue check marks whining, like
Well, I've never seen in real time an algorithm that promotes such like hot button or like a controversial shit as thread stuff. Like it
yeah.
moves quick. Like
They
I've
took
seen
all the
it.
lessons from Twitter and accelerated it in a weird
Yeah.
way. Like they
Fucking
don't have as much
wild.
Nazis, but it's so aggravating. Like I don't know. I will say like one of the great privileges of our generation was watching Twitter descend into what it's become. Like there's not a better, whenever it's time to write the great novel of this era, it's
Yeah.
going to be about Twitter's like rot. Like
Oh my
that,
God,
it's
yeah.
the most perfect encapsulation of like late internet, late capitalist, whatever the fuck. But yeah, no, yeah, follow me on Instagram. I'll be talking a ton about it whenever I'm allowed to. But
Okay.
yeah, it's the first time I've ever had something like super, super, super secret. And it's fun, but I'm also like kind of chafing. I want to start telling people about
Yeah, no, that's very, very fair. I'm not good at keeping secrets, so I get it.
it.
But no, this has been really lovely, John. Thank you so much for the deep dive on both of the books that I've read from you. And again, really, really excited to see what else is coming from you whenever you can talk about it. Is there anything that you wanted to bring up or talk about that we didn't mention before we sign off?
Oh God. No, yeah, I don't know. Go protest and go vote. Like that's
Hmm.
about those are the only things that I think are I can really bring. We've got a November, the elections in November probably going to decide the fate of our country. So go
Go
vote.
vote. Yeah, no, go fucking vote. Yeah,
That's about it. And like the parties aren't equal. Don't listen to your dumb leftist friends who pretend like it doesn't matter. Like it does. Go vote, please.
Yeah, no, no. As somebody who was just like at the gym a couple hours ago and had to see like CNN, Fox, and then also a Lifetime movie playing at the same time, it is a dystopian world that we are living in. So
America, fuck
please
yeah.
go vote. Please go
Yes,
vote.
please. But yeah, no, this has been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh my God, no. And if you want to come back whenever you can talk about whatever you can't talk about is, we'll definitely talk. But thank you so much, both the Brightlands, Midnight Knock, and your other book, No One Home, No Way
No road
Home,
home.
No Road
No
Home,
road home. Yeah.
is out on shelves. So everybody should go pick those up. I still need to pick up No Road Home. But thank you so much, John. This has been such a treat.
Thank you so much. It was an absolute pleasure. I hope you have a great day.
Thank you.
Take care.
A really, really big thank you to John for taking a full hour and then some change to unpack two of his books that, like I had mentioned, I got the chance to read over my little winter hiatus. John is such a cool person. I really, really love what he's doing within the crossover space of the horror and thriller genre, and so I really recommend that you guys go check out his work. And quite fittingly, at the end of that conversation, when we talk about if there's anything that we need to discuss that we didn't touch upon before, we talk about the importance of going vote in November. And I normally don't really comment on a lot of this kind of thing just because I feel like I am a really, really young person in a world that there's so much going on, and I am not the most informed person when it comes to our worldly affairs and politics in particular. However, what's happened this weekend with what's going on in, you know, in the world is just really rough. And to live in a country where the killing of our own people, our own citizens, and the attitude that has facilitated that kind of action has been really difficult, and it's hard to think about a future where things look good in this country whenever this is our frequent reality. And that goes without saying for anybody who's been handed cruelty at the hands of our government. Um, but in this very way, it feels particularly bad right now. So, my desperate call to you all today on this very bright and cheery first episode back is to be there for your fellow man, to be there for your friends, for your family, to show up, to exercise peace, to stand for what you believe in, um, and to not lose hope. Even though I sound like I don't have a whole lot right now, um, I do believe that collectively we can come together to inspire change. It feels really isolating right now because that's the way that all of this has been constructed. The opposing narratives, the, you know, echo chamber that is social media, that you just keep seeing these things over and over again, and rightfully we should, because it needs to change, but also take care of yourself. It's a complicated issue, but it's also not. So please, everyone, again, take care of yourselves, but also think about humanity, think about empathy, think about how you would want to be treated, and treat others in that same way. That's my biggest plea to you all now. So not to end on a super heavy note, I know that we're all in this headspace, but I'm going to shift gears a little bit here. I do have another episode coming to you all this week because I got the chance to chat with Yaya Schofield, who is the author of On Sundays She Picked Flowers, one of my most favorite recent reads, and that'll be coming to you on Friday because, why not pull a double feature listening event for your first week back in the podcasting space. Until then, take care, everyone. Just be good.